This is part 2 of a 2-part interview. Hello, and welcome to Fraud Talk, the ACFE's monthly podcast. I'm Scott Patterson, Senior Public Relations Specialist for the ACFE. In recognition of Fraud Week, we've invited the co-authors of the report to the nations, John Warren and Andi McNeal, to talk about the report and how they collect and analyze these invaluable fraud statistics. They'll also give tips for any organization to help prevent fraud. John Warren is the ACFE's Vice President and General Counsel, and Andi McNeal is Director of Research for the organization. Welcome, John and Andi. Now, John, let me ask you this. Is there an aspect of the report that particularly interests you when you're compiling the research?
Yeah, a few things actually. Since I've worked on every report dating back to the 96 one, so I've had a chance to see this study grow over the years. In 2010, we made a pretty big shift in how we developed the report. Prior to that, going back from 2008 and before, the cases were strictly derived from US-based CFEs. And in 2010, we made the decision to open the fraud survey up to all certified fraud examiners throughout the world. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that it reflected a shift in our own demographics. ACFE, when we did the first one in 96, we were a heavily US-based organization. I would guess probably 95 to 98% of our members were probably in the US at that time. That's no longer the case. Over a quarter of our members live and work outside the United States now. So it made sense to incorporate their feedback into the study we're doing. But also, as Andi said, we've seen a growth in global commerce, and money moves across international borders and changes currencies every day, thousands or millions of times a day, and it's natural that fraud would follow those sort of patterns and trends. And so, it didn't make sense for the report to be based just on U.S. information anymore. It needs to reflect what's really happening out there. So in 2010, we opened it up to international members, and we really expected that we would see a big shift in the data. We thought when you're looking at frauds that occur in Asia or Europe or South America, we're going to be seeing substantial differences from what we saw when we were looking at U.S. cases. And probably the most interesting thing is that we didn't really see any big changes at all. It's kind of amazing how similar fraud trends are, regardless of where you're at. The breakdown of perpetrators by position, breakdowns of departments, how frauds are detected. When you look at industries that are affected, all kinds of different demographics, tenure of perpetrators and so forth, they're all very, very similar, regardless of whether you're looking at a fraud in Asia or in the US or wherever. And it kind of underscores that it really is a global problem and speaks to the nature of global commerce now, that you don't have these big divisions anymore. There are, however, a few differences in the international data that were kind of interesting. One of the things we did not expect to see, but that we did, is that median losses outside the US were actually much higher than within the United States, which surprised us, and we have a few ideas of why that might be, but we really don't know at this point. We've done 2 rounds of international data now, and we're going to continue to watch that to see if that continues to be a trend. Rates of anti-fraud controls tend to be higher outside the United States, which seems to go against the idea that losses are higher outside the United States. Again, still watching to see what might be the cause of that. The other thing is higher rates of corruption in areas outside the U.S., and that's been very interesting to us. A few possible explanations for that. One is when you look at Transparency International's corruption percentage index, the U.S. rates pretty highly in that. In other words, rates low in terms of corruption. So one possible explanation is that when you get into certain frauds occurring in countries in Asia or Africa where those countries tend to score lower on the index. Possibly what we're also seeing is just a reflection of the fact that anti-corruption investigations are more of a priority. The U.S. has a statute called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a big focus of the U.S. Department of Justice right now. A lot of enforcement efforts being directed toward that. So consequently, I think you see organizations directing a lot of their anti-fraud efforts at catching corruption cases that occur outside the U.S. where the FCPA applies. And now the UK has a similar new bribery act. My guess is when we see the higher rates of corruption outside the U.S., I don't really necessarily think an organization might be more prone to corruption just because they're in Asia or Africa. I think we're probably seeing a reflection of these enforcement efforts trying to deal with corruption cases in these jurisdictions.
Andi, what about you? Any aspect of the report that's really of interest to you?
I really find the data that we collect on internal controls fascinating, as sort of contrary as that might seem. But I think it's really enlightening to look at what companies are actually doing to fight fraud, as well as then looking at which of their efforts are most effective in actually preventing and detecting fraud. So when we're looking at the companies that were defrauded as part of the cases that are reported to us, we collect information about 15 different anti-fraud controls and whether those organizations actually had that control in place when the fraud occurred. And we also take that information and run comparisons on the losses that are experienced by the organizations that do have those controls and compare those to the losses at the organizations that don't have those controls. And that really gives us a good idea, some benchmarking information about how effective those controls might be in terms of controlling fraud losses, which, when organizations are looking at where they want to invest in anti-fraud efforts, they certainly want to look at cost-benefit analysis, and if we're putting this much money into setting up a certain control, are we going to save ourselves those funds later? So for me, what I find really interesting in this area, though, is the comparison of which controls companies are really relying on and which ones are doing the most to fight fraud. So what we see is that external audits are just consistently the most implemented control. And that's not too surprising. A lot of companies have to abide by regulatory or lending requirements that involve an external audit. And we generally see over 80% of the organizations that we study have undergone external audits during the time of the fraud. However, what is telling about that, though, is that we're seeing that those audits are actually pretty marginally effective in fighting fraud. Auditors and accountants know the concept of the expectation gap, and that a lot of people really expect audits to do more in terms of detecting fraud than they're really designed to do. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I think the report that we put together actually gives a lot of merit to that concept, in that we see that the fraud cases in our study, only about 3% of them were actually detected through external audits. So 80% of companies are using them, only 3% of the cases are coming in via that method. And then, as I mentioned just a second ago, we compare the losses at the organizations that have these controls with those that don't. And again, external audits come in at the bottom. I believe it's only about 3% decrease in losses at those organizations that have audits. So we're talking very minimal difference. So that's, for a lot of companies, an external audit is a big expense. There's big fees that come with paying auditors to audit their books. So they're putting a lot of money in there. And what we see is that it's really just not necessarily a cost-effective measure specifically regarding fraud detection. There are other reasons that it may be necessary and helpful, but it certainly shouldn't be a company's primary anti-fraud measure.
Yeah, we're not saying you shouldn't get external
Absolutely
audits, but don't rely on them to catch fraud.
Exactly, that's exactly it. And on the other hand, on the other side of it, what we're seeing is there's certain controls where they're much less common in terms of implementation, but they're much more effective. If you look at the controls that we're seeing that about, they're the ones that really focus on sort of the human side of fraud. The controls that we see most commonly implemented are external audits, they're internal audits, they're management review and management certification of the financial statements. Things that are all rather process focused. And they really focus in on the opportunity part of the fraud triangle. But when we look at what's effective, we see that it's the controls that address the other parts of the fraud triangle that really have the most impact. It's things like fraud training for employees and employee support programs that really give employees other tools when they're experiencing those difficulties so that they don't have to resort to fraud. So to me, that's a really fascinating thing. It's that, I have an accounting background, and certainly from that background, you sort of start to look at fraud as an accounting problem, but when it really comes down to it, it's a human problem. It's not an accounting problem. So all the internal controls that a lot of companies think of as foundational and as necessary, and they are for many reasons, they aren't necessarily the ones that are best suited to fight fraud in the organization. And along those lines, I think one of the areas where I've been most surprised but also most interested is, we have seen consistently, what probably our most consistent finding is that tips are far and away the most common method that frauds are detected. Over 40% of all frauds are coming in via tip, and in organizations that have a hotline in place, it's more than half. So they are certainly the most reliable method that companies can count on in terms of how they'll learn about frauds. But at the same time, when we look at the frequency of controls, we see that just over half of organizations are doing it, which means, or they have a hotline in place, excuse me. So when we look at how frauds are detected, and we know that they come in through tips most often, and yet we still see that organizations, only about 54% of organizations have a hotline implemented. So that means almost half of them are not taking advantage of that tool as a way to collect information about frauds that may be occurring within their organization.
And just from reading the summaries of the cases we get, in almost every case, it seems like somebody knew the fraud was going on or somebody suspected the fraud was going on, right? Wouldn't you say that's fair to say, Andy?
Absolutely, yeah.
And they either don't report it because they're afraid they'll be portrayed as a snitch, or they're afraid to report it, they're afraid they'll be retaliated against, or they think some things may be wrong, but they don't know for sure, so they're uncomfortable reporting it. And that's where fraud training, I think, is really important, right? You help these people understand, yes, this is wrong. If you're seeing this, that's probably a sign that somebody's doing something they shouldn't. It helps them understand why it's important to report it. Frauds, companies go bankrupt because of frauds. You need to report this. It's a matter of your own well-being as well as the company's well-being. And then, like Andy said, just understanding how. Hey, we've got a hotline. You can call. You don't have to give your name. You can just call and tell somebody that you're concerned about this, and we'll look into it. But just simple steps like that. We're not talking about any rocket science here. Just letting people know, give us a tip and we'll follow up on it. It goes a long way to detecting these things.
I'm glad you mentioned training for employees. That's something during Fraud Week that we encourage our supporters to do, and a lot of them are doing it during Fraud Week, communicating fraud awareness either through communications, e-newsletters, emails to the staff, or actually having trainings, physical trainings where their staff come. And this is kind of giving them something to rally around, a week dedicated to fraud. That's a good time for them to do it. Andy, also, I want to mention you made a good point. You said fraud is not an accounting problem, or not just an accounting problem. It's a human problem. And I think behind these statistics, that's something that the reader can take away from this. John, as an anti-fraud professional, someone looking at the report, they have 80 plus pages of great data here, but maybe everyone's busy, they're working fraud cases. What should they be taking away? What are some of the key takeaways for someone working on fraud, for a fraud examiner?
Well, again, if you're an anti-fraud professional, you're probably trying to explain to somebody within your organization that they need to pay more attention to fraud than they are. I mean, there's very, very few organizations out there where you would say the certified fraud examiners, the audit staff feel like they've got every resource they need, right? So one of the constant struggles for folks in those positions is just trying to demonstrate a return on investment, trying to get your organization to dedicate more resources to this subject. So, use it to educate whatever your constituency is. If you're reporting to the audit committee or the board of directors or a line manager, take the report to them, show them the numbers, show them the losses that are associated with these cases. And I will say, a lot of people are confused about this. In the cases we looked at, $140,000 median loss. That's not median loss per organization. That's median loss per discrete scheme. So these are large dollar cases that are happening over and over again in organizations. So I would hope that anti-fraud professionals could take this and use it as a way to help sell the value of their own services, get your company to hire more auditors, invest in a hotline, invest in some fraud training, do something to help minimize the threat. And then also, we didn't really touch on it, but there's a lot of stuff in here where you can look in greater detail. Look for organizations like yours in your same industry or your same geographical region to see what kinds of threats they are experiencing, and hopefully learn something from that. There are 6 departments that historically account for about 80% of all frauds. That's useful. If you've got limited anti-fraud resources, you obviously want to point those in the direction where they're going to do the most good, right? So you don't want to be focusing your audit efforts on some department that accounts for 3% of frauds in a typical organization like yours. You want to point it at the ones that are most likely to cause the largest losses. So you can find all that data in the report to the nation. And if people have any questions about how to interpret this, or if they have any follow-up questions about what does this mean, or how can I use this, we encourage them to call myself or Andi anytime at ACFE, email us. We're happy to respond to inquiries about this. We want it to be a useful resource for our members and for non-members too, anyone who's interested in this subject.
And even along with that, contact us with letting us know what's the most useful or ideas that you think would be useful for future reports. We actually have incorporated several ideas that we've gotten from readers, members and non-members of the ACFE, in terms of, what are you all seeing in this regard? And we've taken those and we look at those and see if there's something we think would be useful for our readers. We'll take a look and possibly include them in future reports.
And as you mentioned, not only for members, for non-members as well, but this also isn't just for anti-fraud professionals. The information here is useful for anybody. And Andi, what would you think are some of the most valuable points to take away for a business leader or for a business owner who looks at this report?
I think there's actually a lot in here for business owners, and we write it not just for anti-fraud professionals, but also so that it can be useful for people outside the profession. And I think for business executives and business owners specifically, it's a really fantastic benchmarking tool. It can give them a lot of information where they can compare their organization to or similar organizations in their industry or of a same size or in their geographic region, which can really help them get a feel for the pulse of their anti-fraud efforts. It can also, in extreme cases, be a wake-up call. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of people out there that still think this couldn't happen to us, and looking at the body of information in this report, you can clearly see it can pretty much happen anywhere. And then finally, I think this, and John mentioned this a little bit in terms of really analyzing your anti-fraud resources in dollars. I think you can certainly use the information in here to hone your fraud risk assessments, making sure that you're hitting on the areas that are common risks in other organizations of your type, and then taking that information and comparing it to what we're seeing as effective controls and detection methods that are most common, and using that to create your overall organization's anti-fraud program.
Great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Andi, for giving us a real good inside look at the report to the nations.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. You've been listening to John Warren and Andi McNeal talk about the report to the nations and Fraud Week. The report itself can be downloaded from the ACFE website at acfe.com, and more information about International Fraud Awareness Week can be found at fraudweek.com. Again, my thanks to John and Andi for speaking with me today, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us in another edition of Fraud Talk.